poverty, and around this concept that I'm still working through of information redlining and connecting it to what I think is a discourse that is long overdue for libraries, and I'm hoping to continue to add to it, which is a critical race theory framework that is necessarily and importantly informed by the notion of information and education access. So I'm going to begin now, and I'm going to be asking the amazing and, pun intended, powerful Kimberly to advance some slides for me so that I can kind of concentrate on these notes that I like to cobble. If you remember, I like to write over everything, and I'm still the same way. But again, I want to talk with you for a bit about race, redlining, and resistance. Libraries in the making of what I believe will be the next, we are on the precipice of it right now, civil rights movement. And so on we go. So to the next slide. So the things that I really want to make sure that I stress are really 4 key points. One is the notion of information access as a social justice and public health issue. The second one is, what role do libraries play in the fight against information poverty? So I want to establish some baseline definitions of information poverty, and I want to position libraries in a place of intentionally countering information poverty, which will require some interior work in libraries. And I want to say that neutrality in this particular case is dangerous, if not damaging to the credibility of libraries in the contemporary age. The third piece I want to talk about here is what I consider to be where we are now, which is the next great wave of library services. And I believe that it will be the third great wave of library services, and I'll explain myself on that. And then I want to close with, how do we close the digital divide, and how do we solidly place libraries in the vanguard of the next civil rights movement, the next wave of the civil rights movement? And I want to draw your attention here before we move the next slide to the image that I chose, because I do believe that we have the convergence of 2 issues here, 2 pandemics, if you will. One is a public health crisis, but the other one is a crisis of social justice. It is a conversation where we cannot be passive in the conversation about racial equity and economic inclusion. It is a conversation that I think has reached a boiling point. And as we enter this year that also includes an election, I think that it situates public health and economic mobility and race in the same conversation. And all of that is buoyed or destroyed, if you will, by information gaps. So hence this idea that libraries and we as library professionals cannot remain neutral. Next. So here I want to talk about information poverty, and I want to talk about this idea that poverty is intractable to the degree that it is accompanied by information and network poverty, poor social networks. So again, let me repeat that. Poverty is intractable, right? Insurmountable to the degree that it is accompanied by information and network poverty. All right, and that's exacerbated by poor social networks. And we really see poverty's intractability in places where we have racial segregation accompanied by economic segregation, right? So let's think about Connecticut, for instance, right? In Connecticut, we have some of the wealthiest human beings that live in this country, sometimes just a community away from the poorest human beings that live in this country, right? And I could tell you more about this, but if you've ever taken the drive up Albany Avenue to West Hartford, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you've ever mind the difference between some of the mansions in New Haven and walked up to Fairhaven Heights or up to Newhallville, then you know what I'm talking about. But what's important for me in this conversation here is that this conversation is bespoke, if you will, to Connecticut. Because in Connecticut, we have two communities living side by side with within sneezing different distance, right? And you know what I'm talking about, because we're in a pandemic, within sneezing difference of each other, and we have exponential differences and an exponential range of incomes within sometimes just two zip codes. All of that accompanied by also too lifetime economic outcomes as well. And I'm seeing Bina saying that, hey, Bina, I'm saying that, you know, Bridgeport is one of the poorest, right, cities, but think about what Bridgeport is surrounded by. So we have, in terms of lifetime outcomes and life expectancies, we have this real range in Connecticut. So when I'm talking about information poverty and the roles that libraries play, I'm talking about a conversation that is almost bespoke, almost made for, almost fitted for Connecticut. And I write this and I come to you because of my own experience working, living, and actually being a library activist in Connecticut. So I want to situate each of you specifically into this conversation. This is not a talking head conversation. There's a call to action for you. So when we think about information poverty, I want to kind of unpack it a little bit using Johannes Blind's definition, saying information poverty has been described as a situation in which individuals and communities within a given context do not have the requisite, underlining requisite skills, abilities, or material means to obtain efficient access to information, interpret it, and apply it appropriately. So I want us to think a little bit about that. I want us to think, for instance, about how we might hear about jobs, how we might hear about if you are a parent, how we hear about babysitters, how we hear about free items, how we hear about programs, how we hear about it, how we hear about things, or how we heard about the things that actually became sort of the pathway to our economic mobility or our economic independence, or how we heard about jobs, or how comfortable we were that we would be part of a network where we would hear about good housing. And I'll give you an example of that for me. When I became a librarian, I had a career. So I used to work in homeless services. I used to direct a homeless shelter before I became a librarian. But I want to just let you know that I've always been Black. No matter what career I had, I have always been Black. So what it would mean sometimes is that I wouldn't hear about really good apartments, or I wouldn't really hear about things that were like free or low cost. You know, in fact, I wasn't a part of certain types of economic, certain parts of information networks. So I'll give you a contrast between my first apartment in Seattle when I first came to work for Seattle Public Library and my second one. So the first one that I heard about was at that moment, it was $525, and I read about it in a paper, and I put that in a list with other apartments that I wanted to look at, and I went up to Seattle from Los Angeles, where I was living at the time and where I was born. I was running a homeless shelter, and now was being interviewed for this job at Seattle Public Library, and once I got the job, I started looking and I went out. So the second place that I went, the super said, well, you know, well, let me start with the first one. The first apartment I went to, I called, and, you know, this is like in the 90s. And when I got there, the super said that, in fact, the apartment that he had just told me about was available. When I got there, he said that in the interim, it had been rented. So you can do your own math there, right? So the second one I went to, the super told me, in fact, we only rent to professionals. There's only professionals in this building. Do you have a resume? And I said, well, I happen to, because I you know, having been Black all my life, I know that sometimes going for apartments, I would need to kind of bring things that other people wouldn't necessarily have to have. So I showed the person my resume, and I was so put off by the question having to do that I had to tick that off of my list. The third place I went was right across the street from the Harborview Mental Hospital, and the super welcomed me, and they had plenty of vacancies, and I moved in. I want to contrast that to my second apartment in Seattle. By the time that I had begun to work at Seattle Public Library and work amongst librarians, many of whom were Seattleites and knew different people in the community, we were riding through this very desirable community that was very close to the library that I had actually never really walked in or spent too much time in, because it was a little bit, you know, I would say a community that didn't have a whole bunch of people that looked like me, unlike where I was living. I commented to one of the librarians, we were going to a meeting at another branch, how beautiful the neighborhood was. And we saw a for rent sign in a yard. And she said, well, there's a for rent sign. And walking around, she said, oh, and there's Gary. Gary actually owns this building. She pulled over and she said, Gary, this is Tracy. She loves this apartment. She'd love to know more about it. It turned out to be one of the best apartments I ever lived in, and one of the best locations I ever lived in. And you know what? It was only $25 more than the apartment that I was living in. You know what had changed? It wasn't my education. What had changed was my social network. So one of the fallacies I think about this idea of the information network is that the people who are experiencing information poverty believe it's their fault. When the reality is, and you'll see where I'm going, when the reality is that information poverty is a continuation of racial exclusion and discrimination, and a continuation of economic exclusion. So I'm saying this because I want to remind us that libraries are part of someone's information network, right? In economics, the cycle of poverty is the set of factors or events by which poverty, once started, is likely to continue unless there is outside intervention. Families trapped in the cycle of poverty have either limited or no information resources beyond their network. There are many disadvantages that collectively work in a circular process, making it virtually impossible for individuals to break this cycle. And this occurs when poor people do not have the resources necessary to get out of poverty, such as financial, capital, education, or connectedness. So I want to say, in other words, that impoverished individuals that do not have access to economic and social resources they experience their poverty. Their poverty is compounded. And this lack may increase their poverty throughout their lives. It means that the poor remain poor throughout their lives. So as we move on, Kimberly, I want us to sort of think about libraries as interrupters. I want to think about us as a core of library professionals or information professionals. I want to think about us as interveners. And again, and I'm hoping that some of this, or maybe a little bit of this, will make you uncomfortable, because if you're too comfortable, if I'm too comfortable as a result of this conversation, I have not brought the urgency with which I wrote what I am sharing with you. So let's move on. All right. So what I want to do here is I want to bring you a little bit into my world. So I'm downtown right now. I'm in the Magnificent Mile in Chicago, and I am about 112 blocks from where I live. Right. So I live in the Pullman neighborhood. Pullman because of Pullman Porters, George Pullman, all of that. I live on the far south side. I live in a neighborhood that during the pandemic, as I've been taking ride shares more and more, especially late at night, I live in the place where the Uber or the Lyft driver starts getting scared. You know, the further that they go, sometimes, and also where I might have to choose the service a little bit earlier because maybe the first one or two people are going to cancel if they get a whiff that I'm going beyond the loop south, right? So that's where I live, right, every day. If you look at this heat map, it's a pandemic heat map of Chicago. If you look at it, if you see that really dark place at the very bottom here, the darkest burgundy, southernmost piece before you get to Indiana, that's where I live. And I want you to see that from east to west, west to east, it is burgundy all the way through. Because I live in what our public health professionals call a hotspot. I live in a place where the density of infection is greater than one out of every 10 residents, right? So I live in a place as well where we are seeing disproportional, not just infection rates, but disproportional deaths. And I want to say that, of course, amongst Black and Latino people, and I also want to say, too, as we're talking about information poverty, I am just blocks away from the Cook County Jail, which at one point during the pandemic was the hotspot in the nation in terms of the highest density of people who were infected. The only difference is that people there who were incarcerated or detained pre-sentencing, right, and some pre-trial, right, didn't know that they were in one of the hottest spots of the pandemic. They didn't know because we already know right now that people who are detained or incarcerated more and more are losing actually rights to access information, and that in our prisons and jails, we have conditions now where books are contraband and where people who are accessing information are sometimes having to pay 30 cents for a minute for access to the internet. And in some cases, access to the internet is the only way, if they are allowed at all, to access outside information that they can. So the exorbitant prices, if you've ever had somebody who's been incarcerated, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I will raise mine. If you have ever had somebody who was incarcerated, you know how expensive a telephone is, right? A telephone call is. So imagine that their only access to information has been raised to that premium. I would definitely want to say that because we will be judged, I think, in this profession, not for our service necessarily to the people who came to us, but for our service to the people who didn't. I believe that that is the shifting paradigm of libraries. We have had too much of a y'all come, and it hasn't required that we change one iota. And I think that's a problematic that we have to address. So many see a correlation between inequitable health outcomes and access to technology. When our public health professionals in Illinois, as well as our governor, we're talking about what's exacerbating these dark burgundy places on the map. 2 of 1, each of them said that there is an information gap, that we lack both the information infrastructure as well as access to the devices that could inform people and keep them aware and raise the visibility of potential infection rates, et cetera. That is our call to action. So I want to give also the instance of the historic city of Detroit, which prior to me working now, coming back to ALA, I spent a lot of time in my previous position working in a foundation in which one of my territories, one of my cities was Detroit. In the historic city of Detroit, which has the lowest rate of internet access of any big American city, with only 4 in 10 of its with only 6 in 10 of its residents having access to broadband, or 4 in 10 of its residents lacking broadband, according to the FCCC. Detroit is also one of the cities where COVID-19 contagion rates are disproportionately high. So we're seeing here, again, remember I was saying the twin pandemics, the public health crisis, as well as the racial equity and economic justice crisis. I believe that's what this is all about. I think that, you know, in this way, those of us who are actually made it into this Zoom forum, we enjoy a real and a certain privilege, a privilege which, in light of the current coronavirus pandemic with which we are wrestling, necessitates that so many of our essential convenings be held online. We, in enjoying this privilege, we are, in many ways, if we continue to ignore it, we're creating inequity that we will not be able to abide. And I wanna just remind us right now that only half of the world's population now uses the internet, okay? So alongside access to food, to social services, supports, to medical care, and to public transportation, all of which are determinants in the overall health of a community, the American Medical Informatics Association contends that access to broadband access, access to digital access to internet service should be included as an indicator of public health due to the growing role that the internet plays in connecting patients to care, and due to the growing interdependency on the internet for all of us, and especially for just in this particular time, individual health maintenance, access to workplace continuity, and to education. So we're going to continue to move. I'm going to look in chat right now and see what you're saying. So all right. So I think I'm caught up. Okay. So what I want to just keep saying, you have to sometimes you know, say it, you know, different ways. I want to look at this idea of blight, you know, which heretofore has been sometimes nationally restricted to certain types of zip codes, right? And so that we are almost made to believe that the disinvestment in some cases are almost the fault of the inhabitants who remain in those geographies, right? But because I believe that we are going to see much wider scale changes in our economic marketplace, I want to remind us that the same disinvestment that produces housing, blighted housing, that produces dispossession, that produces communities that have sometimes a tangential or itinerant relationship, even if they've lived there their lifetimes, because they aren't necessarily given the supports or feel the empowerment of stewardship, that the same disinvestment that produces the image to my left of the house and all of the content scattered outside also produces this. And this is, and what you see here, of course, is a closed library, a library that is not only closed but has been chained closed. And I believe that right now, what we're seeing at the American Library Association, what we are seeing across school and public and academic libraries are a wide scale and unprecedented change in terms of reduction of hours of service, layoffs, furloughs, et cetera. So much so that, one of the things that we're trying to stand guard against here is the erosion of library access and library services in our lifetime. It requires that we remain ever vigilant, and that we wear our advocacy hats, not just our service hats, but our advocacy hats when we think about the future of libraries. Kimberly will continue here. But I want to say something here, and maybe, maybe this is this area of discomfort. I want to kind of back and talk about a longer history of information redlining. And I want to remind us that contemporary public discourse around race and class, especially the racialization of class, when they become conflated, and come together, Black and poor, Latino and poor, as Ntozake Shange says, that kind of redundancy, right? That contemporary public discourse often neglects to make the critical connection between the not so distant reality of de jure by law and de facto by fact of compulsory illiteracy, and the treatment of information as contraband for African Americans. And I want to say this, and I want to stick this, I want to stick on this because, one of the underlying foundations of Connecticut's wealth, right, is its early primacy as the insurance capital of the nation. And I will leave it to you, my information professional colleagues, to better understand where and how that foundation in insurance was built, whom was being insured, why was this insurance being offered. So, I'm saying that this particular presentation is bespoke to those of us who practice in Connecticut. Next slide, please. So we had early slave code laws that in some ways created a hierarchy of infractions, right? Stealing, running away. But I want us to look at the infraction for reading and for having access to information. Because again, I want us to kind of have a historical reference point for this conversation about information poverty within the lived experience of a group of people or who are still in many ways being penalized for this. So here, this is 1818, Savannah, Georgia, and this is an excerpt from a Georgia slave code. The city has passed an ordinance by which any person that teaches any person of color, slave or free, to read or write, or causes such persons to be so taught, is subjected to a fine of $30 for each offense. And every person of color who shall keep a school to teach reading or writing is subject to a fine of $30 or to be imprisoned 10 days and whipped 39 lashes. So here what we are seeing is we are seeing fine, imprisonment, and corporal punishment. And if you have had any experience looking at slave code laws, you see that for some really grievous offenses, one of these things is one of these lines of punishment is enacted. But here, the reading, teaching people to read, giving people access to information is penalized by all three. And that's something that I want us to think about, because I do think that there's something in our ontological DNA that has made it okay for certain groups of people, not just people of color, but also people who are poor, people who live in certain areas, people who live in certain service relationships with people who are wealthier, that has made it okay, that has made information poverty okay. So we're going to keep moving here, Kimberly. Before I move on, let me just stop and see how you're feeling, because I just want to see if you're with me. Use chat. I mean, you know, I want to just see how you're feeling. I'm gonna slow it down for just a minute, because I want to make sure I don't lose you. And you can just type in, you know, a couple of you, how you're feeling, how you're following. Yeah, I just want to see what you're saying. All right. Thank you. All right. All right. So I think Melissa, and I see my old and good colleague Todd Hampton giving us the backstory there. All right. All right. So we see more in terms of slave code or black code laws coming out of North Carolina. Again, the same thing again and again. All right. And it is, you know, also, I think, further explained why the code law is so severe. And it says that the reason for this law assigned in this preamble is that teaching slaves to read and write tends to dissatisfaction in their minds and to produce insurrection and rebellion. So I think you're doing the math, right? Because everything is circular, right? Everything is circular. So I'm not going to try to drive that home. I just want to make sure that we are, you know, I want to make sure that we don't have the pretense of naivete. So let's move on here. For nearly a century after freedom from enslavement and forced illiteracy, the nation's answer to Black Americans' desire and enthusiasm for learning was consistent and pervasive discrimination. Persistent and pervasive discrimination, basically a wheeling of information poverty and a making of information impoverishment a condition by which people had to navigate their lives. We're going to keep moving. By the time we had reached, you know, the pre-civil rights movement in the 30s and 40s, public facilities were segregated throughout the South. There were separate schools and restaurants, and of course, there were, if they existed for Blacks at all, there were separate and unequal libraries. So much so that the first, the earliest demonstration or civil rights demonstration that we know of was said to take place in a library. When citizens staged a civil protest in 1931 and walked into a library and one by one began to ask for library cards, and when refused began to sit down at tables with books and quietly read. And the reaction it was incredible, right? The police were summoned and the library clerk panicked, saying there are colored people all over the library. So we're going to keep moving here. And I want to bring this home because we lost a giant this year in Representative Lewis. And I'm going to be quiet here because out of deference for Representative Lewis, but I want to make sure that you read his quote if you can see it. So here we see Representative John Lewis himself, who was married to a librarian. So, you know, early in his, you know, even before really his political career took bloom. He was married to Lillian. He met his wife, and she when she was a librarian at the um, Emory Library, right, in Atlanta, and he talks about his experience cutting his teeth as a 16-year-old activist and going to a library and being denied service, and that keeping him out of that library, out of that public library, until he became an author, until he went there for a book signing. You know, John Lewis is exceptional, right? My question when I read this excerpt is, for all of the people who were not John Lewis, who didn't ever go back because you know they had a book signing, what did the cost of paying for a library, right, as a taxpayer, that they did not feel entitled to use or welcomed in, what did that cost them? And as parents, what did it cost their children and their children? That's a question, just a question. And here on the right-hand side, we see how pervasive the idea of information access through a critical race theory lens. We see how pervasive it was, and how critical it is that we reflect on it. So I'm going to move on, and I'm seeing some of you picking up some of the key ideas, and I want to talk about information redlining. And I want you to think about I want you to think about what would happen if your information access was restricted. What would that mean on an economic, educational, and social opportunity level for you, for your family? What if you suddenly had no consistent access to digital infrastructure or to information or devices? And I'm going to ask you just to write in chat, if you would. I want you to write in chat what would happen. Let's say that you didn't have access for 2 months. Just I would love to hear from at least three or more of you. So while you are typing, if you will, isolation, depression, disconnection, anxiety, despair, depression. As you're continuing, I want to just remind us that 28% of Americans do not use the internet at all, citing all kinds of reasons. I don't want to leave people with disabilities out of this. You know, sometimes we create environments that do not support everyone. You know, this idea of universal access is something that we are still struggling with. And of course, the notion of universal broadband. I believe that universal broadband is attendant to the right to read today. A recent Federal Communications Commission report stated that 21 million Americans fully lacked broadband internet access. And I keep driving that home because I want to say that these people may believe that their information poverty is their fault, but it really isn't. It is shared. So, and Roseanne is saying it's almost impossible for people without such access to apply for jobs or services. When I used to teach in information management in library school, when I stopped teaching was 2011, and at that point, fully over 60% of all job advertisements were only found online. And I know that that number has increased drastically since I was teaching. I just don't know what the data says today. We'll move on, Kimberly. So here, I want to look at the work of Freda Chapman, who did research amongst janitors at a particular university. And what she found is that their perception was that they didn't have any way to tap sources of information that might increase their advantage. So their idea that whether or not they could get ahead, whether they or not they could get into, other jobs or even find a better job as a janitor somewhere, all of that was stymied by the fact that they felt that they didn't have, and they themselves identified sources of information that were expansive, that they didn't have access. And I want to say that because I want to try to underscore what I'm saying here is that information poverty compounds poverty, and that we are the interveners, and that libraries have to be the interrupters. We'll move on. So I want to argue that we are now on the front lines, that library services are on the front lines, that we are in what I consider to be the third great wave of information. If the first great wave of library and information services in the late 18th century through the early 20th century was about pulling the public towards reading literacy. There was a joke that we had at one point more libraries than we had literate adults. The second wave was in the latter 20th century when many of us in some of our Gates programs that we had in libraries began to introduce technological literacy into the populace. Then the next and third great wave of library and information services has to be to exteriorize, to bring outside into the public realm library and information services and close the digital literacy and data access gap. Today, we're seeing images of children outside of libraries when they're closed, or in the parking lot of fast food restaurants trying to access the internet. We're seeing that because 13% of white students were sometimes unable to complete their homework due to internet access, according to a Pew study, compared to 17% of Latino students and 25% of surveyed Black students. As an extension of the right to read, we have to be thinking about universal broadband. A 2019 Pew survey of offline Americans found that 32% said that the internet itself was too difficult to use. A lot of times that's because of reading levels. Another 19%, almost 20%, said that the cost of owning a computer and getting internet service was a barrier. The United Nations itself has identified the imperative of universal internet access, which it defines as getting 90% of the global population online, as its central goal. And I want to remind us that the number one provider of internet and broadband access in the country remains libraries, school libraries, public libraries, academic libraries. And we have seen so many studies that tell us that the poor, as well as people of color, have an over-reliance on libraries for access to the kinds of information that others take for granted. So I want to ask you, as we begin to move on, what expanded role do you see for librarians? What expanded role, non-traditional role, do you see for information professionals, especially as we faced what I consider to be two pandemics? We'll move on here, Kimberly. So I think that I am one of those people that believes that libraries can play a role that no other institution in the public realm can. The public realm can. I think some of the most meaningful and timely information services take place beyond the reference desk and outside the library. And I want to draw attention to, there's some quotes there for you, or just some factoids for you, but the one I want to draw attention to is in the middle. Is this idea of Claude Steele, who says that sometimes asking for information can put certain groups at risk of feeling like they are compounding a negative stereotype about themselves. So just the act of asking for information, and any of us who have done reference and user studies, we know that only 1 out of 5 people who have a question when they enter a library actually go up to the reference desk, right? So we've talked about that. We talked about that over 10 years ago when we were looking for distributed reference. But I want us to think about realizing that the people who need us the most are not coming to the library at all. So we have to rethink our services. And those of us who are fighting, especially now, to kind of continue or maintain our library services within our building are asking for too little. We need to be asking for corollary research outlets in the community, embedded in the community. And I know you have really great imaginations, and you can imagine what that would look like in a barbershop. You would imagine what that would look like in a laundromat. You can imagine what that would look like in a public health clinic. You can imagine what that would look like, fill in the gap. And I'm not just talking about for public libraries, but also too for community college and for academic libraries. We have to flip the script. Mary Rowe calls out the micro inequities, subtle differences in tone, gesture, attitude, manner that come into play when we interact with those we perceive as different. And I want to say this because sometimes we can be Connecticut cold, okay? Can I say it because I love it? Can I love it? Can I love you? I'm gonna love on you a little bit, Connecticut. Connecticut is one of those early places, so it can be that kind of like, kind of like a cliquishness, right? I knew it because one time when I first came to Connecticut, it was really cold, and I was walking behind two other women, and I heard one of them say to the other while shivering, "It's really brisk outside, isn't it?" And I said, "Oh man, brisk is one of those words for cold, but it's cold to me." And that's when I introduced myself to Connecticut. So what I'm saying to Connecticut is this is that time for us to recognize that what we also have to break through is a certain type of classism and a certain type of parochialism. I'll just put it like that, especially when we think about the next wave of library services, which I believe will exteriorize the library, which will turn the library inside out, or else risk the credibility of the library. Okay, so we'll go to the next piece, and in this piece, I'm bringing it home here. I want to say, what is the next wave of the civil rights movement? We have had the fight. We've had a civil rights movement that's been placed on a colored line. We haven't had an extended civil rights movement that's been about class. And I think our next great civil rights movement will be about access, information, access being at the heart of it. And of course, because this is America, notions of race and notions of class will continue, but they will be, I think they will be joined by the information gap. So I want us to think about some things, like how are people engaged in service in our institutions to communities? I want us to think about the Civil Works Administration, the Public Works Administration, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the work that they did around 1937, 1940 to actually put people's libraries outside of workers' camps, and in places where workers were most likely to work in dangerous environments. They wanted to provide information access, reading, introduce reading as leisure, but also introduce the idea of reading and access to information as a means to economic mobility. And I wanna say that we can't wait. I wanna say that to wait for somebody else to solve information poverty is like people waiting for Amazon to end information illiteracy. It is not going to do it. It's not set up to do it. That's our work. And so I want to say that waiting is a privilege that we neither have nor have we earned. And I also want to say that I think that we must invoke, as Octavia Butler has said, we have to see to it, right? We have to see to it, right? We have to see to it. And I want to remind us that half of the world is looking at us. So this image that you're seeing here is what happened when Black college women, a Delta Sigma Theta sorority, knowing that libraries were still segregated in the 40s and 50s, when they joined money together, bought books, bought a bus, and hired drivers to go throughout the South, to distribute reading and information materials. Here's your picture of one of those outlets. They took it into their own hands. And some of the places that they routinely went, libraries, branch libraries began to crop up there. They would receive from the American Library Association an award for forwarding for moving library services forward. But it was a group of people who took it into their own hands. Let's take it into our own hands. Let's take it into our own hands. We are living in an era of information redlining. And I believe that the very credibility of libraries and as an institution and libraries as a core of professionals is going to rest on how we tackle this issue of information poverty and the divides that it has created. So I would like to you know how people ask, are there questions for me? I'm sure there's going to be a couple questions for me. I wanted to beat you to it. Next slide, and ask some questions of the group. So if your questions start getting slow for me, I'm going to ask you some. So because I really want to make sure that my speaking to my home people is not in vain. That I take this position not because I was looking to be the head of anything, but I take this position because I do feel that those who sacrificed away from me are requiring that I speak not just about the niceties and the possibilities of librarianship, but about the gaps and the urgencies that we face. So Robert, come on in and facilitate some Q&A if we still have a little bit of time to do that.
Yeah, and I was trying to unmute myself because I was very, very involved, but I wanted to take a minute to thank you, Tracy, so much for zooming back into your home state and doing this presentation for us. Did anyone have any questions in the chat? I saw that there was some fantastic conversation happening in there. Or did anyone have any responses to Tracy's questions that I'm going to leave up on the screen for you all? I can tell you, Tracy, that while you were talking, shortly before COVID happened, the town that I live in West Haven, we were gonna have a book sale. So I pulled all these books that I wanted to donate, and they've obviously been sitting behind my couch. And now I'm like, all right, I'm gonna go to the laundromat. I'm gonna drop out some books. I was like, I'm gonna go to some free libraries. I know there's 2 in West Haven. I'm gonna drop out some books there. I'm gonna build these little libraries for these babies because I got these books that I literally typed that into my phone. Go to the laundromats. West Haven is 11 square miles. There's like 9 laundromats here. So that's my first step personally. Fina, if you want to unmute, you're welcome to do so. Thank you for asking.
Kim, what you said about taking books to the laundromats and stuff, we're withdrawing some books from our library, many of which are still in fine shape. And I contacted the high school, whose the principal is the brother-in-law of one of our staff people, and they're not allowed to accept any books at this point. So I think I may take a lead from your laundromat and free library idea. We also have a couple of places in New Haven. There's New Haven Reads, and then there's Read to Grow, which will take books. And I have a lot of books, boxes of books that are review copies I've gotten. And so I think that's a way to try and get them out. Or, take a suitcase, suitcase, take your car out filled with books and then stand outside and hand them out. It's hard to do that. But Tracy, a lot of what you said made me think about the Ryan Dowd training that the Bridgeport librarians have been doing on Niche Academy. And one of the things that is very valuable in his work is making it so that we have better ways of dealing with people who are definitely underserved and who are maybe having issues that we can't possibly understand, and not making it a hostile situation, but making it a collaborative situation, and sort of, not letting these people, sort of do their laundry in our bathrooms, but to make them feel like they're respected as human beings. And I think that that's a big challenge for everyone, especially in this environment right now. So.
Thank you, Bina. Thank you. Elise, you want to jump in, and then maybe I'll respond to what maybe Bina has said and what you have to say.
One thing that occurred to me is that sometimes people won't pick up a whole book. One thing that I do, and I'm not doing it right now because this pandemic has closed the door, I would take magazines. I usually have subscriptions to magazines to the emergency room. I would drop them off in the hospital or sometimes doctor's offices where I know people are just sitting there and their minds are just going through all kinds of places. So I would encourage you to think about other literary sources. Of course, we have to close the digital divide, but at the same time, if we can build reading, and I think sometimes if people have something in hand, they will read it and take it home. Sometimes when I've been back to the ER, I find all the magazines are gone, and asking the people who work there, they said people took them home. So that's a good thing. That's my little contribution right here for a minute.
Yeah, I'll say this.
Hey,
Yes, go ahead.
one thing I really enjoyed your presentation, very informative. And one thing that I keep on thinking about is a digital divide. And one thing that we have to keep in mind, how do we feel about certain things? So before we can even present a program or project or feel like we want to go out and save the world, we need to know who we are, and we need to make sure that we're okay with having that attitude when we meet people that might not look like us. A lot of us came from the areas that you mentioned in New Haven, and we feel very fortunate, and I'm sure that there are people in other parts of Connecticut and that feel the same way, that we're really fortunate because so many of our relatives did not have a chance to be where we are right now. So you mentioned it also. We are like pioneers. We're trying to make a way for others to follow behind us. So that means we have to make sure that we open the area for all to come in, that you are welcome to come in, but also make sure that we understand the history and make sure we appreciate where, the John Lewises and others that have made so much happen just for us when we weren't even thinking about it. So it's just so much for us to do, and we definitely have to think outside of the box. We definitely have to, because they're not coming in. So what can we do?
Right. I want to say this because I'm seeing so much. You all, I think, obviously, you have the spirit, and that's why I knew I could be really direct with this group. But I want to say some things built on what Vina is saying, Elise is saying, what you're saying, Vivian, and what I'm reading in chat. I do believe that I do believe that text is that when we talk about content, we're not only talking about books, but something that I have observed, and I used to do it a lot more than I do it now because I've been very preoccupied with having a new job, is that I would try to recreate a social network for folks. So with social media, I would use my social media to take jobs. Sometimes I would just search on the internet jobs that I thought were at different levels, and I would post those jobs, or I would look at all of the jobs that might be coming up, like, and collating them, like friends saying, we're hiring here, and like putting that together in a list and just putting it out on social media. And the same with it when it comes to housing, like housing that I think is affordable. Sometimes, using my own sort of sphere. And even now, I will say there is a young woman, well, there's two. There's an apprenticeship in Chicago. And I know that a lot of those people don't know about apprenticeships, in terms of the fact that a lot of the people who have the apprenticeships, their circle are people who don't necessarily need them. So what I've been trying to do is to put the apprenticeship out there, and two young women have said, thank you so much, because my mom or I saw the apprenticeship, and thank you for introducing me to it. So I want to say that I think that we ourselves can be interveners. When I worked at Albany Public Library, I used to take a lot of stuff and put it in Scott's Bakery, which was right down the street. This West Indian, Jamaican pastry shop. Of course, I would always get something when I went there, but I would actually have a whole list of things to post so that people could see. So I want to just say that, we do need, and I think a couple of people have said this, I think that we need a core of information navigators. And if I ever get some grant funds to do this, I would love to start it in Chicago and maybe in Connecticut as well. I would love to see a core of people, of librarians and other people assigned to community-based organizations who actually were in laundromats, who were in all of these other places doing story time and supporting people with navigating information. We need that. I actually think that we need to be asking our federal government for support. We need to go back to the Workers' Progress Administration and create a core of information navigators. I mean, I can tell you in Connecticut, we need that. I mean, and we have some of the finest libraries in the country in Connecticut. So not only would people be getting just straight information access, but from some of the most erudite offerers. I mean, you all take that idea and let's work on that. Because Vivian, you're right. The people we most need to serve, some of them are in the library, but most of them are not. And if we start waiting for people to come to the library, we would be back with the banks when everybody went to tellers. Banks have proliferated, and even we have online banks, because banks said we're going to go to where people who have money is. And you know who they followed? They followed the check cashing or places that started to proliferate. When they saw that people wanted this quick kind of like more transactional exchange, banks had to kind of step up to it. We should be so much further along than banks. So I want to say all of the ideas that you have, as long as you can see a market for it, as long as you can see an end user, move in that direction, because I know that there's a new wave of librarianship that is also being created. Kimberly and Robert, how much more time do we have? Do we have more time for one or two questions, or what should we do?
I think as long as people are in here and want to ask the question. Yeah, Robert?
Yeah, I think you can, you have time for a couple more questions.
Okay, let's see. Before a question, anybody want to make a statement? Something I won't respond to, but because there's so many incredible people in here, I would love to hear a statement or two. What you're thinking and where you're at right now.
I have one statement this is the item coming from the bookmobile world. And I will tell you that going out into the community is like the best PR for libraries. And of course, everyone can't get into a library, so we must go to where they are. And the bookmobile serves that purpose. So I just want people, if you have a bookmobile, make sure you ask your legislators to continue to support your town so that you will have that service. Because when I used to be on the bookmobile, the kids would be running up. They couldn't wait for us to get there because they could not get to their branch or downtown to the Hartford Public Library.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
I just had an idea as a result of this conversation, and I was thinking about children. And a lot of times, children are in the laundromat. some laundromats have forged ahead and they put like play equipment outside the laundromat or inside. But for the vast majority, I mean, even to have magazines, it's a good thing to have them in there. But I thought we have Ellison equipment, the letter dies that cut out bookmarks and shapes and things like that. And I was just thinking, you know, we could do some pre-writing skills or just a fun activity that would promote eye-hand coordination by taking some of those shapes. And I mean, these letter dies, they're letter dies and also shapes, putting them where children can get their hands on it. You know, my background is working with young children especially, but that was just a notion that I had just now, that can be done for free. You know, I mean, just to cut out some shapes out of fabric or tin or magazines or cardboard or whatever with some crayons and put it somewhere where children can get to it. I think that is something that I could do.
I'm gonna jump in
group
and
homes. Can I
Yes.
just mention group homes too? When I was in Connecticut, I put group homes in my rotation because having worked in homeless services, I knew both adult group homes for people who might have developmental delays or who may have been injured, as well as youth group homes. Well, for one thing, a lot of group homes don't have a lot of they don't, you know, they're kind of like in the shadows, and sometimes you come in and what you're bringing is really the biggest intervention that somebody really has had. The other thing I just want to say as we go on is that let's remember that poverty is often hidden. So in addition to places where we think like, oh, okay, information poverty, you know, I think there is a specter too. I want to just mention in terms of poverty, poverty in suburbs, poverty in affluent communities where people might live like in the service class. And I also want to say, like in places, there's a lot of white poverty where people who haven't necessarily had access to education, you know, and there's a lot of shame around poverty in a lot of different places. There's also a lot of illiteracy, like actual adult illiteracy. And so I just want us to think like in a, you know, as we're rising to this, I feel like everyone is 33 of us here. I think that each of us, if we were to write out 4 places that we want to imagine ourselves as an intervener, and if we want to imagine our libraries as an interrupter, I think we would cover a lot of ground.
I love that we're talking about this. And Elise, your idea was fantastic. And just to sort of remind everybody, that's exactly the type of thing that we can do as the Connecticut affiliate group of BCALA. Right. I mean, I understand that we have to sort of remain in our own bubbles, which makes it a little bit difficult, but there's no reason why we can't get together at a member meeting and figure out a way to put these craft kits, take and makes, which a lot of folks are doing at their own libraries who work within youth services, and do some of this distributing as an organization, because I've seen that some folks mention staffing issues, maybe some support issues from your administration, which is a battle in and of itself. But what we're talking about is exactly the kind of thing that this group can do. It doesn't have to just be bringing in fantastic conversations from Tracy and from other folks at National. This is something that we can do. And we're having a member meeting next week. If you're not a member yet, please join on our website, bcalact.org.
24th, yeah.
Next week, 24th, yes.
Yeah, Tracy, I wanted to mention one thing. One of the problems that we're having in some of the communities in New Haven and in our area is that some of our children, of course, with the pandemic, there's a need for our children to be at home and to be at school and to have access to the internet. And a lot of our children do not have internet access in their homes. And so what's going to happen is that a lot of these kids are going to end up, if they don't have that access, if they can't get to a library where they can connect to a Wi-Fi, if they don't have someone that can be with them throughout the process, they're going to fall behind. And so that's a concern. For a lot of our children, and a lot of things that are happening in these communities that are stricken with poverty. And so that's one thing that that's on my heart that you know that we need to really look at.
You're right. You know, wow, you know, you hit it right, because we're going to see some students really miss out, especially those students who are exceptional high achiever families who come from low income households. I was one of them, right? So because school in some ways was providing the kind of educational support and infrastructure, you know, that they had. And we got to be radical about this. So I'm going to say some things that are crazy, but I would say this. What are some ways that we could, first of all, Ida hit the nail on the head. We got to deploy our bookmobiles and our mobile. We got to get out there with hotspots. We have to be in places. We got to set up, and I know it's colder in Connecticut, like in Chicago sometimes. We got to be able to set up, you know, from 3 to 6 p.m. To do some homework help outside. But here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to go old school on you. We also have to get some hotspots and some repeaters. We need to be able to work with, you know, you all have, I'm not going to name the provider, but you all have some internet providers that are making some bucks. We have to be able to get some repeaters and to extend the Wi-Fi access outside of our public libraries and our schools at least by a mile, so that they can almost create a kind of network, even if we only do it during a pandemic. The other thing that we can do is that we can also create these things and set them up and drive through and just be places where people are. We can also work with fast food restaurants and have a partnership with fast food restaurants and also with stores. I mean, in this case, like, let's imagine, you know, many of you may know this because my aunt used to be a bigger presence, you know, when she was alive. She died this year, ironically, the same year I came into this job. But I get a lot of my approach to public libraries and to librarianship because my aunt was a public health nurse. And I know, Ms. Josephine, you know this because I've talked to you about this when I was a lot younger. And the ways in which public health nurses work in the field is how we have to work. So like Robert, we got to get it done, because we're going to see not only people losing their jobs, but we're going to see people who do not finish school because of this pandemic. I mean, people are going to drop out of school in the 7th and 8th grade because listen, I mean, this is real. And I think we're going to have to almost do this as if we were talking about public health.
Right. Absolutely.
Tracy, I'd like to say a few things. I'm no longer a public librarian, but I'm still one in my heart. I'm a law librarian now, and we are always looking for ways in which to share our information with other public libraries or anyone who's willing to open up a book and utilize our expertise. Those who can't represent themselves in the legal community. We are often caught up with not being able to represent ourselves in court, so you're left to your own devices. But we as law librarians, we do our best to try to help prepare them for dealing with that issue. So we really feel that sharing our resources is very important. And I think as librarians, we should know that sharing our resources is only going to make us better, stronger, and more able to help those who are in need. So I just wanted to stress the fact that we do need to share our resources. You know, sometimes we hold too tight to our chest some things that we don't want to share with others, but we've got to be more open with the sharing. That's all I need to say.
That's it.
So good. I just want to ask Kimberly and Robert to close us out, but not before I say thank you. As I was putting this presentation together, I did it because of my love for Connecticut and my passion for it. I will always consider it home. It was the home of my first home. The first home I ever bought was in Connecticut, and Connecticut is where I really learned the field of actually practicing as a librarian. And for that reason, I look forward to seeing how I can be of service as you actualize on anything that you're trying to do to close the information poverty gap and to eliminate information poverty and information redlining. So again, thank you. And I look forward to seeing you in person.
Thank you, Tracy, for, I'm like starstruck a little bit, I'm not gonna lie, but thank you so much for coming, and thank you everybody for attending, and let's keep this conversation going in all of our listservs. This was recorded. I'm gonna go ahead and stop recording now. So share this with anyone who was unable to attend.